Welcome everyone to this Tessian webinar where I will be exposing the blind spots of traditional email DLP, or in other words, I'll discuss the shortcomings of email DLP and why it just doesn't make the cut in terms of preventing data breaches, showing value, and being cost effective. Before we delve into the webinar, I just wanted to make a note that if anyone has any questions throughout, feel free to write them in the text box on the dashboard. My colleague Karina will be monitoring throughout our discussion today and will be replying to people. If we don't manage to do that during the webinar, we'll follow up with you directly afterwards. So a brief introduction to myself. I'm Ayala, and I'm a member of Tessian's enterprise team. As part of that, I work with quite large businesses, mostly part of the legal and financial space. And in the most recent months, I've been working specifically with Asia Pacific and the Nordics. Both of them are new markets for us. So it's been really exciting for me to introduce people to Tessian for the first time, walk them through our platform and technology, and identify exactly where we could add value to them. And through that, we help them secure their key data and gain a competitive advantage over peers in the market. If you think about it, I think your own clients really expect that you have the most robust cybersecurity stack that there is. And if you are seen to have something that's better than your peers, that definitely sets you in an impressive position. And outside of cybersecurity, my two main interests, I'd say, are cycling and yoga. So yeah, I'd be really happy to hear if anyone else has similar passions. So before I set today's agenda, just a brief note that DLP is quite a large category, and today I will be focusing specifically on email DLP. And the reason that I'm doing that is because if you think about it, we spend most of our digital time at work on email. And that's perhaps not most, but around 40% of our digital time. And we actually process more and more sensitive client and company data on email. So think back to, I guess, today's email activity or emails that you've sent back and forth. How many of those were sensitive, and how many of those included maybe more than two parties? How many of those included attachments? So if we think about the main vulnerability of businesses today in terms of data, that's email. So in short, we'll be focusing on DLP for email today. So the first point that I'll be making is setting the current landscape. What kind of data breaches are we seeing, and how are businesses reacting to those? How are we trying to solve them? We'll then look at the specific challenges that we're trying to solve with email DLP. We'll move on to looking at where email DLP actually falls short and what are the shortcomings and disadvantages that our clients as well as just businesses as a whole have seen. And then fourthly, I'll end with our key takeaways and a note about adding automation to DLP with machine learning. So I think a lot of us know that there are over 1,000 solutions in the market today. But despite the fact that there's so many, do they actually fit the bill? And if you look at some of those logos, you probably recognize quite a lot of them, and quite a few actually provide email DLP specifically. We've actually seen that in the recent years, data breaches have continued to rise. And especially in the last maybe 2 to 5 years, they've risen really sharply, with 900% rise between 2005 and 2017. But before we go into why email DLP isn't helping reduce the number of data breaches that we see nowadays, what actually is email DLP? So data leak prevention, or DLP for short, is a feature that prevents specific information that you set up yourself from leaving your organization via email. So all outgoing email will be scanned for keywords and regular expressions that you manually configure within your DLP system. And some of those keywords might be credit card numbers, personally identifiable information, perhaps bank account numbers, etc. Things that you really deem to be valuable to the business, and if they go out of the business to a person that they shouldn't go to, that would be costly either because of breach of regulation, perhaps breach of specific client confidentiality agreements, and this, of course, affects reputation in turn. Looking at today's current landscape, though, we see 60% of businesses still use rules for storing and moving personal data. At the same time, however, we see a 75% increase in the number of data security incidents reported to the Information Commissioner's Office in 2018. So despite the fact that we're using a lot of rules for sending and receiving emails, we still see quite a sharp increase in the number of data security incidents. And I think the most interesting figure for me personally is that 60% of enterprises say that they focus more on rapid response because prevention is too difficult to achieve. So if we unpack this, we can see that businesses are more comfortable being reactive, so after a breach or incident has happened, because the way that we're able to prevent breaches nowadays are too burdensome, perhaps too expensive, perhaps too complex to actually be able to achieve efficiently. And I think this is quite troubling. So I think it's around this figure, this fact really, that we'll be focusing our discussion today. What challenges do we traditionally aim to solve with DLP? And I discussed that there's extremely sensitive information that we communicate by email. What exactly is that information? So I have 4 different examples over here. I'm sure that at least 2 or 3 are applicable to each one of you. And yeah, one example is leak of customer PII. I think this is especially the case if you operate in a sector like legal or financial services, which is extremely heavily regulated. Otherwise, we have a potential leak of your internal IP to a competitor. Of course, that could be damaging to your own company designs and the advantage you hold over your peers in the market. We can also have a sensitive company document accidentally sent to the wrong client. Here, this could be, for example, a price list that goes to client B instead of client A. And of course, we want to prevent this from happening so that client A or B don't feel that they're being disadvantaged. And finally, there's specific inside information or non-public information that if leaked or sent to the wrong or unauthorized person could really have a material impact on the price perhaps of an underlying investment, the ability to release an IPO, and such activities. And if we think about it, what are the ways in which current businesses have tried to prevent these types of incidents from happening? So in terms of setting up rules, from my own experience, I've spoken with quite a large investment bank who designed their own DLP platform over quite a few years. And their bespoke DLP platform actually contained more than 60 different rules. And some of these rules were, for example, every time someone sends an email out, checking the content and seeing whether this mentions a specific client account, and if so, alerting the end user. Another example is checking for email invites that are being sent to external recipients rather than internal, and flagging in every case that they go externally. Another example is every time someone sends an attachment that's an Office document, prompting the end user if those documents are password protected. Finally, another rule is if someone sends out an email to, let's say, more than 15 recipients, flagging that to the end user and seeing whether they're okay to send that through. So yeah, I think the next question to ask is, where does legacy DLP actually fall short? It seems like we create quite specific, bespoke rules to solve very specific issues that we've identified by virtue of breaches that have actually happened. And something that I've seen with quite a lot of our large customers is that initially they build bespoke internal solutions because there's no DLP that solves all of their nuance challenges off the shelf. And I think this raises quite specific problems. So the team or person, depending on the size of the organization, that builds those bespoke systems become experts at doing that. And if this person or team moves forward, this creates quite a large burden on the rest of the organization to understand how those rules were set up, train maybe the preceding person that takes over this team on how to configure the rules, how to maintain them, and how to make sure that new joiners, as well as continuous serving staff, are trained to understand how to best interact with those rules that have been set up. So in short, current DLP is not very customizable. And as a result, a lot of enterprises actually spend a lot of resource, both time and money investment into designing their own bespoke DLP to get around that. Secondly, end user experience with legacy DLP is really not optimal. So my first point here is that employees or end users really have to adapt their day-to-day business activity. So as I mentioned before, some of the rules might want to prevent people from sending an email to more than 15 people at once, or to send an email containing a Word document that isn't password protected externally. And every time something like this happens, the employee receives an alert asking, "Are you sure you want to do this?" or maybe outright blocking their ability to send the email. And this means that instead of having a really smooth flow of emails going out, people actually have to amend their behavior. They have to constantly respond to messages that they see. And this brings me on to my second point around pop-up fatigue. If you've set up a rule where every time someone sends an email, perhaps to a competitor that has been flagged as part of a blacklist, or every time someone sends a rule to an external domain, every time someone sends an email to an external domain, they get a pop-up message, they will quickly become desanitized and not really pay attention to what the message actually includes in its content. We call that pop-up fatigue. So users often seeing these types of messages will simply click yes, go through, and not pay attention to the potential risk that they're causing. And relating this to my day-to-day activity, so I use Gmail. And every time I send an email, a meeting invite to an external recipient, which is almost every time I set up a meeting, Gmail will actually alert me about sending a meeting invite externally. And yeah, I can admit that I never actually read that message. I just press yes, go through every single time. And yeah, unfortunately, that's actually led to me by accident, perhaps emailing the wrong person that I didn't intend on that meeting invite, just because I haven't paid attention to the message. And finally, emails are quarantined where a user is sending an email that actually is caught by a rule you've set up. So this means that often end users have to contact the IT team in order for that email to be released. That can take quite a long time. If this email is in relation to quite an urgent transaction or pending deadline, this can really be detrimental to day-to-day commercial activity. My third point is really around how resource intensive legacy DLP is. So every single rule has to be set up manually and really requires a lot of time investment. So the administration team has to identify every single instance where a sensitive document or perhaps sensitive information pertaining to a client could accidentally or perhaps intentionally be sent to the wrong party. And not only is configuration quite manual and time inefficient, the the maintenance that comes about with a configuration is, again, quite resource intensive. So teams have to constantly look into whether rules are actually relevant to the present day issues that their business is seeing. Finally, with how manual the rules are and the fact that there are so many messages that engage end users, teams actually have to invest quite a lot in user trainings every time they introduce a new rule. There is perhaps a comms message that goes out to the business at large to educate them about the new rule that has been set up. Not only are those rules quite resource intensive, I think you'd agree, and perhaps this is something that you guys have also experienced on your end. Those rules are not only create a really high number of pop-up messages, but a lot of those are false positives. And this means that teams have to actually review a lot of those alerts to find the ones that have actually prevented breaches. And I think just a quick anecdote from my side. One of our clients used to have a team of around 120 people dedicated to monitoring all outbound and inbound emails. And this team looked at each flag that was raised by the rules that they set up. And something that they shared with me is that in 3 to 4 years, they actually only prevented one breach in total. So yeah, taking a step back, this is quite a reactive method of stopping potential email data breaches, and at the same time, it's completely ineffective. And not only is this so resource intensive, the type of administrative work that we're giving our SOC teams isn't intellectually stimulating, it's not empowering, and it doesn't necessarily make people happy at work. So that's quite a practical disadvantage of legacy DLP. My fourth point is around long time to value. So it's really difficult to show ROI and communicate it to the board. When you have to review perhaps hundreds or thousands of flags that have come up, it's really challenging to communicate to the board how time invested and money invested has actually translated into breaches prevented. And as I mentioned in my previous story, the way in which that customer had quite a large team reviewing every single outbound and inbound email and have only prevented one breach wasn't really the type of ROI that they wanted to communicate to the board. And I think it's quite a common trend nowadays to see that boards expect information security to be really tight and robust. However, they expect us to achieve that at the most effective cost possible. And this is quite a challenging dichotomy. And my final point is around the fact that classic DLP leaves a really large margin for human error, and as a result, misses quite a high percentage of breaches. Because we set up rules that are so specific to situations that we've seen in the past, like sending a calendar invite that contains sensitive information to a competitor or to the wrong party, or sending a Word document that's not encrypted or not password protected. We've only set up rules that address those specific use cases. And for the rest of the margin left, we're actually relying on our employees to identify when a mistake has happened that wasn't flagged by the DLP. And if you think about that, we're actually putting a big responsibility on our employees to be honest and transparent. Think back to the last time that you perhaps sent an email to the wrong person by accident. What was the first thing that you did? Did you go directly to your IT team or perhaps compliance team to let them know what you did? Did you get their help in trying to recall the email and realize that that's not actually possible? I think that while I'd like to believe that most people would do just that, we can't actually expect people to always be honest and transparent about the time where they've made a mistake. And as a result of that, we actually don't keep track or record of quite a high number of breaches that happen and that we're liable to report to the regulator. I think classification is also an interesting topic to discuss here. If we think about how much we rely on classification nowadays, and I think we all know that doesn't actually work. I think employees don't necessarily know how to classify emails properly. So for example, I was speaking to an investment bank last week, and they told me about how they sent a survey to a sample set of their employees asking whether they understood their internal classification policies. And I don't know, perhaps surprisingly, everyone responded yes, they know how to do it. However, the next question was asking people how they would classify a certain example of an email that they were given. And when it came to this question, people gave a really broad range of answers. So I think to conclude, we can't really say that in an enterprise of maybe 10,000 people, all of them will classify an email correctly each time, and as a result, prevent sensitive information from leaving the firm. And of course, certain people may not want to classify an email correctly because they want to send confidential information to themselves, for example. So to reiterate, not only do we set quite a high burden on end users to be honest and transparent or to flag incidents that classic DLP misses, we're also in turn putting quite a high responsibility on the administration team to look through logs and find incidents that classic DLP would have missed. In terms of the quite large margin that I mentioned before, this is actually created because data breaches today are caused by people. So where we try to set up rules that are designed around activity we have on email, those are all really specific to people. And I think perhaps we'll all agree that we're unpredictable, our behavior changes, and I think one team has extremely different business communication patterns and styles to another. This, on one hand, might mean that we have to set up rules that are specific to a number of teams across the organization, again, meaning that we have to allocate a lot of resource to classic DLP. But at the same time, legacy DLP will never be able to address all breaches caused by people just because we don't truly understand people's behavior with DLP. So rule-based controls can never be designed around human behavior because it's ever-changing. So to take you back to Tessian that I mentioned in my introduction, our algorithms actually learn from historical email to understand what normal behavior is. So by looking at what you've sent out and received in the last 12 months, for example, we can determine what is normal communication for you, and as a result, what is abnormal. The types of warning messages that we believe in are those that are contextualized, provide quite strong information to end users where they're able to understand exactly why they've received the message and what looks potentially wrong about their email communication. These emails will also be a lot less frequent than those we see with email DLP, perhaps 1 in every 1,000 emails sent out. So in short, looking back to this webinar where we've identified quite a lot of shortcomings that DLP has, I think the key takeaways are that data breach incidents caused by humans will continue to rise. I think we made clear that there's so many different examples of mistakes and of certain sensitive documents being sent to the wrong person on email. And that will just continue to go up and up the more that we use email and the more that data becomes digitized. Current DLP is really resource intensive and ineffective. Breaches always fall through the gaps because we're unable to set up enough rules that will catch all mistakes that people make. Finally, machine learning leverages intelligent data sets and adds automation to DLP in a way that setting up rules on DLP would never be able to achieve. So that's all for today. I realized that was quite a lot perhaps to digest, but I believe that I touched on quite a few themes that would be close to heart for a lot of you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a note on this email address, and we can discuss, I think, how we would address solving or preventing data breaches in a really different way than classic DLP has been doing so far. Thanks everyone for your time today and for your attention, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you at another Tessian webinar in future.